Hi, folks. Welcome to Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. This is our live feature. My name's Hope, and every Wednesday at 1 I'll talk about gardening. And today we're going to be talking about interplanting and intercropping and companion planting and how that can help maximize space in your growing area and in your garden. Those of you who are Newton Community Farm supporters, we just finished our annual seedling sale. We definitely changed a lot of the layout of that seedling sale because of the virus, and we were able to transfer it all to an online platform where folks ordered their seeds, and then we did a safe social distance pickup. So now hopefully some of you watching are folks who have received your seedlings from us or from a garden center or some other place, and you're getting ready to plant. It's that time of year and it's very exciting. And there's a lot of planning that goes into that. So hopefully this conversation about intercropping and how we can maximize our space will be helpful for all of you growers out there. So in my last episode, I talked about how to take care of your seedlings before you transplant them into the soil. So that episode lives on our video page on our Newton Community Farm YouTube page. So you can always go back and watch episodes that we've made in the past. And the last episode might be helpful for you if you still have some plants that haven't been transferred out into your garden soil yet. And as always, we have the chat box to one side of the screen, and you can put in any questions or any comments that you want to add to the conversation. I always love hearing from folks who are watching along. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about intercropping and how that can help us maximize our garden space. So intercropping is a system that employs a tactic of planting two or more different crops together in the same area to typically save space, but there are also a number of other benefits to intercropping our plants. Intercropping aims to establish a more biologically diverse production environment, which can be helpful for insect control, soil health, and overall production of our plants. So there's a lot of good upfront benefits to interplanting in our gardens and in our growing spaces. There's also companion planting, which is another term that has some definite similarities to intercropping. So companion planting has a larger focus on insect control and pest repelling than intercropping, which focuses more on saving space. But they're definitely related, and I'll be using both terms today. And in past episodes, I have touched upon companion planting, but we'll kind of dive into each today and talk about how they can relate to home gardeners. So, like I said, intercropping is the practice of putting two or more different crops in the same space, with the hope and the intention that, knowing what we know about each of those crops, they'll benefit each other and produce a better yield. So there are four main types of intercropping that we see in farm space, in gardening spaces, and in our raised beds at home or whatever kind of spaces we're growing in at home. So the first is, well, I guess I'll touch upon kind of what we're contrasting intercropping against. So if any of you have heard the term monocropping, that's kind of the backdrop that I'm comparing intercropping and companion planting with in this conversation. So if you've ever driven through the Midwest and you've driven through corn country where it's just the same crop as far as the eye can see, that's what I mean by monocropping. So we see one crop that's taking over a large amount of space, or not even a large amount of space, but an amount of space. And typically that one crop, like every crop that we grow, requires certain nutrients from the soil, and it has certain impacts on the land. So something like corn will deplete over and over that same set of nutrients that corn likes from the soil. And eventually it's kind of just degrading the soil over an amount of time. So a big benefit of intercropping is that we're seeing different nutrient requirements from the soil from each crop that we plant. And often that can keep the soil more vital, more reproductive, and healthier overall. So one type of intercropping tactic that we see is called strip intercropping. And if you've ever visited us at Noon Community Farm, we technically employ it there. So strip intercropping is independent rows of different crops planted in the same field. So at Noon Community Farm, we'll have one bed of lettuce that is beside one bed of peppers or one bed of tomatoes. So they're not necessarily intermingling in the same block of soil, but they're all sharing the same piece of land. So that's kind of a broader, um, more commercialized form of intercropping. Because mixing the same crops in the same bed in a farm setting is often not as feasible as mixing them in a home garden setting where we have more liberties with harvesting and we have less time restraints as somebody who's selling to market, for example. So the next form of intercropping is called row intercropping. And this is planting two or more crops in a row together. So for example, you can plant cucumber plants about a foot apart, and then you can squeeze in lettuce plants between those. So those two crops are sharing the same row, but it's still organized into rows that are predominantly serving the main crop, which in that case would be cucumber. And then there's mixed intercropping, which is kind of more of what you would see in a raised bed scenario. So my raised bed outside, I live in a rather urban area. So I have a raised bed, and right now it isn't super full, but it has kind of different plants in different spots. There's not too much rhyme or reason to it. Or rather, there's not too much organization to it, but there is some rhyme or reason in my head for why I'm putting different things where. But with mixed intercropping, there's not so much an order as you would see in rows. And then there's relay intercropping. And that has a lot to do with the timing and life cycle of each plant that you're putting in the soil. So typically with relay intercropping, we see the second crop being planted when the first crop that was planted has reached its production stage. So once those cucumbers, we'll go back to the last example, once those cucumbers have begun flowering and starting to show signs of producing fruit, then you can plant your lettuce and let your lettuce grow in between them, and they're not both at the same stage of growth. Typically that's good for thinking about timing is a good way to approach intercropping in our gardens. So that's kind of an overview so far. And there are a number of benefits to doing this. So the main one that we talk about is saving physical space. So when we are able to think about the different requirements of our plants and how they can interact with one another in the same area of space, we end up being able to maximize whatever space that we have. And we'll talk a little bit about how to best do that with considering the different needs and specificities of each plant that we might be putting in the soil. So one big benefit is resource partitioning. So that's kind of what I was talking about with the monocropping of corn example. So if we know what our corn, or not our corn, if we know what our crops need from the soil and from the land, we can plan for planting multiple crops together that don't compete for the same amount of physical space above or below the soil, the same nutrients, the same amount of water, or the same amount of sunlight. So resource partitioning typically means that we'll intercrop plants that have different requirements from each other in those four categories. So plants that have different sun requirements, water requirements, nutrient requirements, and physical space requirements above or below the soil. So that's resource partitioning. It's both kind of a consideration to take and a reason to intercrop. There's also mutualism. That's another kind of buzzword within intercropping, and that's planting two crops in proximity that actually benefit each other and benefit the overall health of the plant and the overall expected yield of the plant. So that's another form of intercropping and another goal of intercropping that requires us to know our plants pretty well. And then, of course, there's pest management. So a lot of times with intercropping and companion planting, we're thinking about adding crop diversity that can hopefully bring about predator diversity, bringing in beneficial insects that can take care of those bugs that we don't want to be messing with our crops and impacting our yield overall. Intercropping also minimizes weeds by the nature of minimizing the spaces in which they can grow. Intercropping also improves soil fertility, like I mentioned, and it can produce an overall rise in yield. So if it's done correctly. So I think the biggest point to make about intercropping is it really requires us to know our plants pretty well. And like I said, there are kind of those four main categories of what plants need: soil nutrients, sunlight, um, water, and physical space. So if we know what to expect from each plant that we put in the soil in terms of what they need in those four categories, then we can start to imagine how they might be able to interact in a closer amount of space. So for me, when I'm planting anything that I'm less familiar with, or anything that I'm not sure if it would do well in an intercropped or companion planting system, I typically go to a seed website. So for me, I use johnnysseeds.com. That's the website where we, as Newton Community Farm, that's where we get most of our seeds. And so whatever variety it is that I'm growing. So some varieties of a crop require different things than each other. So depending on the crop and the variety, I can go right onto their website. I can look up the crop and the variety, and I can read all about its requirements. I can read how much sun it wants, what soil requirements it has, what to expect in terms of how big it'll get, how much space it will take up, whether or not it will vine and require some kind of support, or whether it will end up rooting down deep into the soil. I can just educate myself on what I'm growing. And by doing so, I can have a little bit of a better idea for what it might be able to survive alongside. So there are three main considerations when you're intercropping in your garden for space. So for now, we'll kind of focus on intercropping as a tactic for maximizing space. So many of our buyers at the seedling sale live in urban areas like myself and may not have, a big open garden in their yard. We might be working with pots on our windowsill to like a raised bed in our yard or on our porch. So intercropping is kind of a good practice to dive into and do some research on if you think it might benefit you in terms of how much space you have with growing your plants. So a big consideration with intercropping is timing. So there are faster growing plants and there are slower growing plants. And depending on the life cycle of the slower growing plants, and of course, how much root space they take up and what nutrients they take up, we can intercrop different fast growing plants in between those slow growing plants to maximize that space. So for example, cauliflower is a crop that takes a pretty long time to yield anything edible. And it takes up quite a bit of space. So they end up getting pretty big and leafy, and they just take their time. They're pretty slow. So when you plant your cauliflower, it might be, let's say, like 10 to 12 inches apart, maybe even more. And it'll take up maybe, let's say you have 4 cauliflower plants in a row, 4 feet of cauliflower that's taking up. And there's a bunch of space in between the cauliflower. You have to weed that space. You have to tend to those cauliflower, but they're not really going to be producing until much later in the season. So intercropping, using the thought process of timing, you could plant a fast grower in between those cauliflower plants, such as lettuce. So let's say you want to plant head lettuce, so you transplant a seedling of head lettuce in between each of those cauliflower plants. Lettuce doesn't require direct sunlight. It's a pretty adaptable plant. It's okay in cooler environments. So something like lettuce could go in there pretty well. And that lettuce would probably grow and be able to be harvested before that cauliflower would even produce any vegetable. So At the same time, fast growers act as a kind of living mulch, so they keep the soil pretty moist and they suppress weeds that would otherwise grow in between the cauliflower. So not only will you be weeding less, but you would be able to have a yield from that space more regularly than you would if it was just occupied by cauliflower. You can do the same thing with annual herbs. Um, they kind of act in the same way as the lettuce would when they're interplanted in between slower growing plants. Typically, something like cilantro or dill, you would get a lot of yield from that, and then after like a month or two, it would start to peter out, and it would be time to pull it and start something new in that space. So not only do you not have to plant those herbs elsewhere, but they also maximize the space that the cauliflower is occupying while it's taking its slow road to production. So timing is definitely a fantastic way to approach um, intercropping in your garden, but it's not the only one. So we have fast growers like arugula, bush beans, beets, spinach, lettuce, radish, and then we have slower growers like tomatoes and peppers and kale and collards and Brussels and broccoli and cauliflower. But they all still have their own kind of plant profile. They each require different nutrients and they each have different ways of growing. So thinking of timing alone doesn't necessarily ensure successful intercropping. So another thing that we think about is shade. So considering fast and slow growers, we can also consider which plants grow quite tall and might produce shade versus which plants don't require full sun and could handle that shade. So cauliflower and lettuce, again, is a good example. The cauliflower leafs out and takes up a significant amount of space, typically shading the area between those cauliflower plants. And the lettuce could be placed right in there. And again, lettuce doesn't mind cooler environments, doesn't mind not receiving full sun. So that's another reason that relationship between those two crops might work out well when we're thinking about it in terms of both timing and shade. We also think about like climbing vines. So if you have any tomatoes that are going to be, rather than bush tomatoes, they're going to be vining and probably needing a trellis or a support of some kind. We want to think about, if we want to plant anything with those tomatoes, what would be a good companion plant to put with those tomatoes that doesn't require the same amount of sunlight and wouldn't necessarily compete for that sunlight with those tall growing plants. Because just like we see in the woods, the taller plants that are reaching up toward the canopy are the ones that are going to get the resources. So we don't want to plant something else next to a sun-loving plant. Or let me rephrase that. We don't want to plant a sun-loving plant next to something that we know is going to vine and be tall and bushy and block out the light that other plant needs. So considering shade is also important. And finally, there's considering the space and the roots. So, we have certain plants that take up a lot of space above ground, but we also have plants that take up a lot of space below ground. So plants that root pretty deeply, like parsnips, those might be good to plant in between crops that send their roots outward. So something like potatoes sends their roots outward, something like parsnips sends them down. So we can think about different ways that, in between our potato plants that we know are taking up a lot of space horizontally under the earth, what could we interplant with those that would more so take up space vertically in the earth? So, that's kind of a way to think about maximizing the space underground so that these crops aren't really competing with each other for the space that they need under there. And then, of course, there's considering, which pests are attracted to which plants. So intercropping two things that are from the same family. So, for example, like, kale and beets. Kale are slower growing. kale require a lot of sunlight. Um, Beets are faster growing. They don't require as much sunlight. So there we might think that they're a good mix, and they might be. But if you have problems with pests that are attracted to brassicas, which both of those crops are in the brassica family and quite prone to pests, it might not make as much sense for you to intercrop those two together if they are going to be depleting much of the same nutrient by nature of being in the same family, or attracting some of the same insects by nature of being in the same family. So again, it's a very multifaceted process. I've been, trying to do my research on what goes well together, and if I plant this next to this, will they both be happier? Will one be sadder than the other? So there's a lot of considerations, I would say, to doing this effectively and doing it in a way that will make sense for the land that we're working with. So basically, awareness of what your plants need is going to be pretty crucial in successful intercropping and maximum use of your space. Even with companion planting and intercropping, we can utilize the ends of rows or the borders of a raised bed, or we can fill in the empty spaces in between plants. So there's a lot of approaches to be able to take here. And there's also a lot of trial and error. Like you might plant one thing next to another crop and it doesn't do that well, and then you just learn, right? So there's probably going to be trial and error with planting your crops in a way that maximizes your space but also keeps everything happy that you put in the soil. And if you're willing to forego the idea of growing in neat rows or growing in a specific pattern, you can be pretty amazed at how much produce your small garden can hold. So with that, I think there's definitely a lot more that we could dive in on companion planting and intercropping and how we can utilize our space very well. But basically, when we're working in our gardens, I hope this is inspiring to see, if you're out in your garden and you see your slow growing plants that are taking up a lot of space and there's all this space in between them, maybe grab some seeds for a quick leafy green and just sprinkle them in between and see what happens. It's all experimentation, and it's all kind of fun. So if anybody has any questions while we're still together here on the live feature, feel free to drop them in the chat box. Typically, I like to talk for a while, and I love getting questions from people to kind of help the ideas along and keep everything relevant for what you folks are looking for in terms of saving space in your garden. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to drop them in the chat box, wherever it is, I'm never sure. But otherwise, we have lots more gardening resources on this YouTube channel. All of our live videos are always saved. We also have a lot of cooking resources for when your crops begin to produce fruit and vegetables and you're wondering what to do with all of them. And we also have storytelling resources, which is great if you have kids at home. And we're live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 1 p.m. So that was a brief overview of intercropping and companion planting. And I hope it's helpful. I hope everybody who purchased seedlings from Newton Community Farm is feeling excited about getting them in the ground, is feeling like they have some ideas for getting them in the ground. And feel free to reach out, and happy gardening. All right, see you next week.